seeing happening in the American colonies and Frederick Douglass. For the paper, it's going to be your job to tease out these similarities, to say that yes, we can see victimization happening with Frederick Douglass, but we can also see it happening in the context of New Spain, for instance. Okay? Now, before I go any further, are we all clear what I mean when it comes to colonization? What does it mean to colonize something or somewhere? Anybody?
Isn't it break into groups, like cultures and...
Yeah, it's about breaking up specific groups to take over land.
Or people and
Yeah, you want them to become British, Spanish, whatever it is that you are. But the general point is to extract resources, right? So that's what they're doing on the Tuckahoe plantation. They're extracting the resource that is labor, and it's making the master very wealthy. What the Spanish are doing, for instance, is they're taking Spaniards and they're putting them in the New World to extract the wealth of the New World, right? So it's about making money for the mother country. Taking people, conquering someone else's land, and extracting all the wealth and resources, funneling it back to the mother country, which will make the mother country not only unimaginably wealthy, but also exceptionally powerful. Okay? Now, the other thing I want to press upon you, a lot of people, when they think about colonization, they say potato, potato. The Spanish, the French, the British, they're all the same. Although the aim and the purpose of it is the same, the approaches were vastly, vastly different. And I want to start out talking to you about the Spanish approach. Okay? Now, for your notes, the geography of New Spain, what you're really talking about is present-day country Mexico. But it stretched as far north as northern Colorado and as far east as the present-day state of Florida. So it's a very vast territory that the Spanish have claimed in the aftermath of Cortez's conquest of the Americas. Okay? Now, what are the Spanish after? Cortez and his crew, they were after gold, right? They want low-hanging fruit, gold, treasure, raid the Aztec temples. But over the course of time, the Spanish and later other European groups understand that there's things in the Americas that can either be developed as cash crops, things like cattle, those sorts of things, or can be mined and later refined that sell very well on the European marketplace. Okay? Now, if you're going to do this, you're going to need a safe and reliable workforce. Right? Who do you think the Spanish envisioned doing all the heavy lifting, the grunt work? The Native Americans. Very good. But think about it. Just like in the case of Frederick Douglass, you're going to have to work pretty hard to convince somebody. You're going to work for nothing, and you're going to give all the fruits of your labor over to me, the invaders, the people that have taken your land. So it's not as easy as it sounds. Okay? One of the ways that the Spanish went about doing this is through the use of the Catholic Church. Right? For your notes, the Franciscan monks. The Franciscans were a religious society, a Catholic society in Spain, who had made it their purpose in life to convert the native peoples of the Americas to Catholicism. They said, we want more Catholics. Now, it was the Spanish government, the Spanish crown, that's bankrolling these individuals, paying for them to go over to the Americas and do this conversion work. Why would the government want to do something like that? What purpose could the Franciscans serve to the Spanish colonists? Yeah? Because if you worship like a Spaniard, if you are a Catholic, then that's separating this old identity before the Spanish came, that you're not Spanish and therefore probably shouldn't cooperate with them. So if you worship like a Spaniard, and you eat and dress like a Spaniard, you ranch and farm like a Spaniard, then when they tell you to get your butt out there in the field and start working, you're not really thinking that you're working for the invaders. You're doing it because you're Spanish and you want to glorify Spain, and you do that by glorifying God, right? And so therefore the Franciscans were very useful when it comes to manipulating the Native American populations. They're doing the same thing to the Indians that the slave owners are doing to the slaves back on the Tuckahoe plantation. They're mind-washing them, right? You're not really Indian anymore. Now you're Spanish because you're Catholic. And so therefore, it's much easier to get them to do this work. But there's a direct connection here, guys. It's a form of coercive, forceful labor. You want them to do the heavy lifting. And you're finding inventive ways to convince them to do this work for very little or no pay. Let me show you what I'm talking about.
Gunpowder frightens the most valiant and courageous Indian and renders him slave to the white man's command. Despite the fact that they were greatly outnumbered by the Native Americans, Spanish colonists quickly subdued and settled many areas of the New World. By the late 1500s, almost 250,000 Spaniards had come to settle in the colonies of New Spain. The hardships of living in the New World were great, but the rewards could be spectacular. Although precious metals and gems were the most alluring products of the colonies, agriculture and ranching provided more stable profits. Animal hides and sugar grown for export to Spain generated a flourishing colonial economy fueled by Indian slave labor. And when the Indian labor gave out, the Spaniards began to import slave labor from Africa, adding yet another lucrative industry in the transatlantic slave trade. While the Spanish colonists were busy extracting the material wealth of the New World and exporting it back to Europe, Spain was exporting a product of its own, Catholicism.
Spain's missionaries in the southwest and the southeast, from Florida all the way to California, were Franciscans. They belonged to a religious order that had as its own mission to convert Indians to Catholicism, which also meant, in effect, erasing Indians' previous religions. But I think, along with that, historians have been very aware that missionaries served a purpose for the Spanish crown. And the Spanish crown was aware of this purpose too in supporting missionaries, namely that Indians would be converted into Spaniards in the process of being converted into Christians. They would learn to dress like Spaniards, farm like Spaniards, ranch like Spaniards.
It was one thing for the Spanish to destroy the great temples to the Indian gods and to remove the priest class that had existed amongst the Indians, but quite another thing to remove the religious beliefs from the minds and hearts of people. And although Catholicism was introduced, missionaries came, and the peoples of Mexico were converted, many of the old ways and old beliefs, the ways of thinking about things and of seeing things, continued on in a new form as part of an adaptive culture in which the ancient ways were adapted to the new religion and to the new demands of Spanish culture.
When other European countries saw the wealth that Spain was importing from its colonies, they too began to look for opportunities in the Americas. To protect its territory from pirates and privateers, Spain established the colony of St. Augustine on the east coast of Florida. Meanwhile, the territory that lay to the north of Mexico and the Caribbean remained largely a mystery. In spite of the failures of De Soto and Coronado to discover hidden riches, many still believed that they were there, and the beguiling myth of the Northwest Passage, a waterway which allegedly connected the Atlantic to the Pacific, continued to exert its power over the Spanish imagination. wealthy silver magnate from Zacatecas named Juan de Oñate set out to colonize New Mexico in 1595.
I think one reason the Spanish arrived or moved toward what is now northern New Mexico is that they were very smart people. They went where the food and the supplies were. And the Pueblo people had lived for several centuries in that area. Their villages and permanent towns and communities dotted the Rio Grande valleys. They were close to the water. They were close to the forest. They were close to river routes that allowed the movement of goods and of supplies. So I think that the Pueblo people, who were divided into, over 20 independent villages, had developed a lifestyle that the Spanish found useful to them.
But less than a year after Oñate and his band of colonizers arrived, the Pueblo Indians had begun to find their presence intolerable.
The Acomans were annoyed, to put it mildly, at Spanish for taking their food, and so killed 11 Spanish soldiers. One of the most controversial episodes in Oñate's tenure as governor of New Mexico was his decision to punish the Acomans who had rebelled. The punishment that they meted out after defeating the Acomans was exceedingly harsh. Oñate ordered the foot to be cut off, or one of the feet to be cut off, of every adult male over age 25. And that has lingered on in the history of New Mexico to the present day.
After 10 years of eking out a difficult existence among the Indians, Oñate and his settlers were no richer and no closer to finding the Northwest Passage. In fact, many of the settlers had deserted, preferring to return to Mexico rather than face the hardships of life on the Spanish frontier. In 1608, some of the remaining settlers moved about 20 miles south of their settlement at San Gabriel to a new home they would soon name Santa Fe.
Santa Fe was founded in this particular location because there wasn't a resident Pueblo population. It was removed from the agricultural lands of the Pueblo peoples, and it allowed the Spanish to separate from the Pueblo communities and establish their own separate entity and empire here in Santa Fe.
The Spaniards may have founded a separate town, but they remained dependent on the Indians for many things, and they were in constant contact with them. As in other parts of the New World, the gradual mixing of races and the blending of cultures would eventually create a new hybrid culture, a place where Indian and European traditions met and overlapped.
So if you had to characterize the Spanish, how would you characterize them as colonists? Say it louder, please. Efficient? Oh, efficient. Certainly efficient through the use of force, right? I mean, you'd be surprised how motivating cutting someone's foot off is when it comes to getting them to do what you want them to do, right? But anyway, they're quite brutal, are they not? I mean, they're quite direct when it comes to the use of violence. So you can make the case that when the Spanish came, the Aztec culture, the former Native American culture went away, and so too did many Native American groups. Now, you juxtapose this, compare it with the French model. Okay? Now, when Columbus made contact with the Americans, this completely fascinated the European mind, right? And what that contact did was it set off a firestorm of exploration. I mean, everybody's rushing to the Atlantic Ocean to try to capitalize on what Spain has just accomplished, right? One of the groups that's also trying to make some hay, so to speak, when it comes to colonization is the French, okay? Along comes this French explorer, guy by the name of Jacques Cartier. And in 1534, he makes contact with northeastern Canada, a region of the North American continent that would later go on to be known as Newfoundland, right? Newfoundland. He claims what is the present-day part of Canada as New France. So geographically, that's where the French are, right? What you call Canada. Now, what the French want to do is the same thing that the Spanish are doing. The Spanish are sending their own kind, Spaniards, over there to extract the resources. The problem is the French king can't get anybody to bite when it comes to going over to the New World. He's offering them the financing to go over there. He's offering them free land, and that was a big deal because in France at the time, not only was land a scarce commodity, there wasn't a lot to go around. If you were a landowner, that meant that you were a really important and consequently powerful individual. But nobody's taking him up on that. So one of the key differences between the French and the Spanish, there are relatively few French colonists. There are few people that are going over there as opposed to the Spanish. Okay? Now, the few that are going over there are developing a very fruitful, profitable industry for the French. Right? Paris is the capital of what industry? Even today? Fashion. And what had become fashionable on the European marketplace was fur, right? Now, in the European context, fur is important for its aesthetic value. It needs to be soft. It needs to be pretty. It needs to be fluffy. That's when fur is valuable. The Native Americans were fur traders too. They liked fur. They valued fur too. And one of the things that the French noticed when they made contact in what is now Canada was that the natives shared this value. Fur was valuable to the natives just like it was to the French. But it also served a very different purpose. Okay? Now, if you've ever been to a zoo, or maybe some place that otters hang out, you can tell me what a coat of an otter looks like. What does it look like? Is it soft and fluffy?
No.
No.
It's brown and flat.
It's flat and it's coarse. It's prickly if you were to run your hands across it. Right? It's almost oily. Why? Because it's a water animal, right? It lives in the water. So in order to keep warm, it's got to keep the cold, it's got to keep the moisture, it's got to keep all of that out. So otter pelts are very coarse. In other words, the European's not going to like it if it's just harvested and sold to them. It needs to be refined. Now, when the French are beginning to interact with the Native Americans, they're noting that a lot of them use beaver, otter coats to keep warm. But if you're a Native American, the best way to keep warm using a pelt like this is to put the fur on the inside close to your body, or the fur pointing outward. What way? If you point it inward, it's much more likely to keep the elements out, just like it had been doing for the otter itself. Right? So most Native Americans wore those pelts on the inside to keep warm. Right? But if you wear a coat day after day, year after year, what's going to happen to it? It'll wear out and you'll need to buy a new coat. Well, the Native Americans knew it was time to buy a new coat when that pelt got soft and fluffy. Because when it's soft and fluffy, it was no longer water repellent and it was no longer very warm. So they threw it away and they got a new coat. Right? But as far as the European was concerned, that's when it's at its peak value. So the Frenchman comes along and he says, that is a beautiful fur coat. I want it because I can sell it for a bundle on the Parisian marketplace. So he reaches into his pouch and he pulls out a fistful of beads, which were nowhere to be found in the Americas. The natives had never seen these things before. So as far as that Indian is concerned, he's not pulling out a handful of beads. That might as well be a handful of diamonds. And so the Native American is sizing up this situation. He said, let me get this straight. You want to give me a fistful of diamonds, and all I have to give you is this raggedy old coat that I was going to throw away anyway? I will not only take that deal, I'm going to laugh all the way to the bank while doing it. It's a mutually beneficial relationship. And the Frenchman couldn't walk away happier because he's got like a kabillion of these beads back in his hut. He didn't have to give up virtually anything. So both sides are walking away not only happy, but thinking that they ripped off the other party. my point. The French fur trade was mutually beneficial. Native Americans benefited, and so too did the French. It wasn't a one-side-take-all, which was much more the case in New Spain. Okay? Now, later on, around about 1637, another French explorer, a guy by the name of Jacques Marquette, who was a term up here, begin to sail down the Mississippi River from the north to the south, and they end in the port city that we call New Orleans, right? But as they're moving down the Mississippi River, what they do is they set up new trading networks with the Native Americans. So not only are they important out here in the East, they're becoming more and more important in what we call the Midwest, right? All this wealth, all these resources are being funneled back to France, where the French are turning it into consumer products and making themselves very wealthy. Okay? Now, if you're Native American, you like the French because they give you stuff that you can actually use. You like them. The other reason that you like them, there's not that many of them, right? They don't pose the same threat that the Spanish and later the English do. They're not going to take over your land, or they don't have that same potential the way that the English did in Jamestown and New England. Okay? Now, the other thing that I want to point out is as they're going down the Mississippi River, they're claiming it all for France. So by the time that the 19th century dawns, all of what you consider today to be Louisiana, northward and westward, is French territory. It's called the Louisiana Territory. And Thomas Jefferson purchased it from the French emperor at the time, Napoleon Bonaparte, and it goes back to this particular time period in French and Native American history. Okay? Now, over the course of time, the French introduced a lot of other cool things that the Native Americans wanted to buy, such as guns. Now, this isn't the first time that we've seen firearms being introduced by European traders. Do you remember talking about what firearms did in Africa? What did they do in Africa? What did they do? Well, yeah, they traded them, but what did it do to African society?
Civil Wars.
Civil wars. Because if you want to be the most powerful African kingdom, you have to ensure that you're the exclusive trader for firearms with the Portuguese. And the way that you do that is you suppress anybody else that wants to trade with them. And furthermore, what the Portuguese wanted were slaves, and in the African context, the way that you harvested more slaves was you conducted more wars and took more prisoners, right? So it was devastating to Africa. The same thing is going to be true to Native America, right? Although the French didn't necessarily set this up as a preconceived plan, ultimately their trading with guns and later alcohol would be devastating to Native American society. It too touched off a series of deadly, vicious war with the Iroquois peoples, okay? So whether you're talking about the French or the Spanish, it doesn't matter. It's equally destructive over the long term, in the big picture when it comes to European context. Now, one last point that I'd like to emphasize with you about the French. They too were interested in converting Native Americans to Catholicism. But the group of people, the Jesuits, that are in charge of converting them are far less coercive than the Franciscans were, right? What the Jesuits do are some of the same things that the early Christians did when they got to places like Ireland, right? They took the indigenous beliefs and the indigenous religions and adapted them to the Christian doctrine. The Jesuits are doing this as well. In other words, they're not just walking in and saying, convert to Christianity or cut off your foot, right? They're adapting the native view of the world to fit a Christian doctrine at the same time. So you can see that the French are going to cultivate and develop a lot of Native American allies over the course of their stay in the Americas. Right? Questions? All right, the last European group that I want to talk about today is the Dutch. Now, this is going to be a little bit confusing. Don't worry, it's not a European history class, and I'm never going to test you on that kind of stuff. But the Dutch are the people from Holland, or Amsterdam. right? Think Germany and think France, and the country in the northeastern middle, northwestern middle, depending on what part of you understand it, that's the Netherlands. Now, before they were the Netherlands were a colony of Spain. And when Spain began to recede as a European power, right, they got their independence. And after their independence, the Netherlands became the financial capital of Europe. Right? Really, you could make the case that they were the financial capital of the Western world, similar to what New York is in today's life, right? But what the Dutch, people of the Netherlands, what they begin to do are the same thing that the Spanish and the French are doing, right? They're trying to set up colonies to enhance their domestic economy, all right? Extract the resources from places like the New World, and what this will ultimately do is it will complement your economy, okay? Now, New Amsterdam is one of the earliest French colonies in North America. Now, its geography, where is New Amsterdam? It's right up here. It's this island that you call Manhattan. What you call New York City was once upon a time a Dutch colony. And they begin to spread out from there and take over places that are now the modern-day states of New Jersey, parts of Delaware. So that's the geography of New Netherlands, or New Amsterdam, okay? But what this is an economic epicenter, right? Everyone's bringing their stuff into New Amsterdam to trade. When I say everybody, Europeans are, right? Native Americans are, and of course, the Dutch are. Why? What is it that New York has that makes it such a powerhouse for an economy? A great harbor. It's right there on the Atlantic Ocean, and it's arguably the greatest harbor port on the eastern seaboard, okay? And what that meant was it was not only easy for Europeans to get to, it was easy for Native Americans over vast stretches of land to get there too. So you've got all of these exotic goods that you can't find in every street corner in America, let alone in Europe. It's all coming together under one roof, and it's the lifeblood of this trade is Indian fur traders, right? All this stuff is being sent back to Holland, the Netherlands, and it's making the Dutch economy exceptionally wealthy the same way that New Spain is making the Spanish economy very wealthy, okay? Now, when it comes to the Dutch treatment of Native Americans, what I'd like you to understand, guys, for the most part, they peacefully coexisted with the Native Americans. But there were instances, there were times when Native Americans really drew a red line and said, we are not going to cede over this land. We're not just going to sign it away and give you accessibility to it. And if that was the case, the Dutch were not above using actual conversion, coercion, right? They would use force, they would use war to get the Native American population to do whatever it was that they wanted. So, were they the Spanish? Well, not really, but were they the French? Not really. They were a combination of two, right? Somewhere in the middle. Now, if you want to break your arm writing this stuff down, you can knock yourself up, and understand, it's up on eCampus, and you can have it eventually, or you can do the 21st century thing and click a photo of it. Doesn't matter to me. What I want to do is leave you with some concluding thoughts, right? And the concluding thought is, North America is never going to be the same after Europeans show up. I mean, what's happening in Mesoamerica? Populations declining upwards of 90% because they have not been exposed to these old world diseases, smallpox, chickenpox, things of that sort. It's happening to a lesser extent in North America. So the population of native North America is going down because these Europeans are beginning to spread out and take over more and more land. But it really doesn't matter what European country you're actually talking about. Whether it's the Spanish that are doing this very directly, that are being very forceful and coercing the Native Americans to cooperate with them, or whether you're talking about the French that are doing it inadvertently, introduced firearms, which touched off civil wars, which devastated the Iroquois nation, right? European contact with the American world was very, very destructive for the indigenous people that were living here, right? Now, this is not going to be the last time that we talk about groups of indigenous Americans, people that were here before European contact. But what I want you to understand is that this was ultimately going to be their own demise. It's ultimately going to end in Native Americans being dictated to when it comes to land rights, citizenship rights, the ability to exist as they knew it before white people started showing up. Question? No, this is happening after European context. What I'm getting at here is this fundamentally changed things for Native Americans. Okay? All right, guys, that's all I got for today. Make sure that you participate in the discussion forum. Have a fantastic weekend. I'll see you next week.